In the small, wind-scoured settlement of Prospect Creek, nestled in a high valley where the winters came early and stayed late, there was a cabin that posed a quiet, persistent question to all who saw it. It belonged to the Hansen sisters, Annalise and Johanna, twins of 20 years who had inherited the small plot after their parents succumbed to a fever 2 seasons prior. The cabin itself was a testament to their father's skill, a Danish stonemason who had built with the unyielding permanence of his homeland. The logs were perfectly joined, the daubing between them thick and seamless. Yet, it was what the cabin lacked that fueled the town's low murmur of gossip. From the outside, it was visibly a single, small room. There was no loft, no lean-to, no second chamber where 2 grown women might lay their heads. Visitors, on the rare occasions they were permitted entry for a brief trade of flour for mended cloth, so only a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a few shelves of preserves, and the monolithic stone stove that dominated the far wall. There was no bed. No mattress, no pile of furs in a corner, no folded bedding tucked away in a chest. The mystery of where the Hansen sisters slept became a source of endless, often unkind, speculation. They were seen at dawn, always together, emerging from the cabin to split wood with a rhythmic, shared effort that spoke of a lifetime of practice. They were seen at dusk, retreating into their small fortress of solitude, the heavy wooden door closing with a final thud against the world. They were hard-working, quiet to the point of being spectral, their faces pale and serious, their identical blue eyes holding a sorrow that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. Their isolation was a wall as solid as their father's masonry, and the community, in its own clumsy way, tried to breach it first with pity, then with suspicion, and finally with the casual cruelty of mockery. The cabin stood as a silent rebuke to their curiosity, its single plume of smoke rising thin and steady against the vast, indifferent sky, guarding the secret of its occupant's rest. The heart of the home, and the heart of the mystery, was the stove. It was a colossal structure of river stone and clay, taking up nearly a quarter of the small living space, its black iron door a grim mouth in a face of grey rock. It was far larger than any stove in the settlement, an object of such disproportionate size that it seemed almost a folly, a monument to a cold that had not yet come, built by a man who perhaps knew more of winter than any of them. The whispers began in earnest at Miller's General Store, the social nexus where judgment was weighed and dispensed as freely as salt and sugar. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the settlement's lay preacher and the self-appointed guardian of its moral and social hygiene, was often the first to cast a stone. "It is not natural," she declared one afternoon, her voice a sharp crackle in the dusty air as she examined a bolt of calico. 2 young women, alone, with no proper place for Christian sleep. What do they do in there? It vexes the mind. Her audience, a small clutch of other women waiting to have their grain weighed, nodded in solemn agreement, their faces arranged in masks of pious concern that barely concealed their ravenous curiosity. Thomas, a young man whose confidence far outstripped his experience, leaned against a barrel of nails and scoffed, his voice loud and dismissive. "My father says their own father was half-mad with his old-world notions. Wasted a month of good summer building that altar of a stove instead of a proper bedroom. They're probably just as queer as he was. Maybe they don't sleep at all." A nervous titter ran through the group. The idea was both absurd and titillating, adding a layer of the supernatural to the sisters' already formidable strangeness. Their foreignness was a stain they could not wash away. Their father, a man who spoke in a thick, guttural tongue and whose hands understood stone better than they understood a neighborly handshake, had always been an object of suspicion. He had not built like the others, with the quick, practical expediency of the frontier. He had built as if for eternity, his methods slow, deliberate, and inscrutable. He mortared his stones with a strange, sticky clay he dug from the creek bed, and he spoke to the rocks as he set them, a habit the townsfolk found both unnerving and heathenish. Annalise and Johanna were his legacy, not only in their shared inheritance of the cabin but in their quiet, unnerving competence. They did not ask for help. They did not complain. They moved through the settlement with a self-contained grace that the community misinterpreted as arrogance. Their grief was a private, unshared thing, and this refusal to perform their sorrow in a way the town could understand and comfort was perhaps their greatest transgression. So the stories grew, each more fanciful than the last. They slept in the rafters like owls. They dug a burrow beneath the floorboards like groundhogs. They practiced strange rituals passed down from their heathen father, drawing strength from the cold earth itself. The community watched them, their judgment a constant, invisible pressure, waiting for the sisters to fail, to break, to finally need them, and thus confirm their own superior wisdom. The stove, silent and immense, seemed to absorb all their speculation, its cold stone surface offering no answers. The rhythm of the sisters' life was dictated not by the town clock, but by the sun and the seasons. Their days were a tapestry of shared, methodical labor, a silent conversation conducted through action rather than words. Before the sun crested the eastern ridge, the sound of their axe would echo in the crisp air, a steady, unwavering beat, Anneliese setting the log, Johanna swinging the axe, a seamless exchange of roles. They did not chop wood with the frantic energy of those who feared the cold, they harvested it with the calm foresight of those who understood its soul. They knew which trees were ready, which wood would burn slow and hot, and which would offer only smoky complaint. Their woodpile was not a haphazard mound but a carefully constructed edifice, each piece stacked to allow the air to whisper through, seasoning the fuel for the long winter ahead. Inside the cabin, their movements were just as synchronized. One would knead the dough for their dense, dark bread while the other stoked the fire in the great stone stove, her movements precise and economical. They wasted nothing. The water used to wash vegetables was given to the small, hardy plants they nurtured in cold frames near the cabin's southern wall. Scraps of cloth were pieced together into quilts of formidable warmth and intricate, if somber, patterns. Their existence was a closed loop of conservation and purpose, a stark contrast to the often wasteful and impulsive habits of their neighbors. The stove was the center of their universe. It was not merely a source of heat but the silent, unmoving third occupant of their home. In the mornings, they would feed it a small, carefully measured amount of wood. The fire would roar to life, a brief and furious consumption of fuel that would last no more than an hour. Then, they would close the heavy iron door and seal the flue, trapping the heat within the stove's massive stone body. For the rest of the day and deep into the night, the great beast would exhale a slow, steady warmth, a radiant, gentle heat that permeated the very air of the cabin, clung to the logs of the walls, and settled deep into their bones. It was a living warmth, profoundly different from the scorching, transient heat of the pot-belly stoves that hissed and glowed in the other cabins. Their neighbors, who had to feed their own stoves constantly throughout the day and night, saw the sisters' single, brief fire as proof of their strangeness and folly, a miserly approach to comfort that bordered on self-punishment. They could not comprehend that the sisters were not withholding heat, but storing it, hoarding the energy of the fire in the deep, patient heart of the stone. The fragile peace of the sisters' isolation was eventually breached, not by a hand outstretched in friendship, but by the sharp prod of youthful arrogance. Thomas, emboldened by the consensus of the general store, saw the twins returning from the creek one afternoon, their buckets heavy with water, their steps measured and even on the frosty path. He stood in their way, a smirk playing on his lips, his posture a study in casual condescension. "Still sleeping on your feet like horses," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin, cold air. "Must save you a pretty penny on bed frames." Anneliese and Johanna stopped. They did not look at him, but past him, their gazes fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks. They said nothing. Their silence was not timid or frightened, it was vast and dismissive, a quiet refusal to acknowledge his existence that was more insulting than any retort. After a moment that stretched into uncomfortable stillness, they simply walked around him and continued on their way, leaving him standing in a cloud of his own foolishness. The encounter, of course, was retold in town with embellishments that painted the sisters as rude and bewitched. But not everyone was so quick to judge. Martha, a widow whose age had softened her heart rather than hardening it, had seen the exchange from her own small cabin. Her memory was long, and it held echoes of things the others had forgotten. She remembered her own grandmother, an immigrant from the German forests, speaking of homes warmed by great tile ovens that held the summer's fire through the winter's darkest days. Later that week, Martha made her way to the Hansen cabin, a small jar of her prized apple butter in her hands as a token of peace. The sisters received her with a quiet, watchful courtesy, allowing her to step inside. The warmth of the cabin was the first thing she noticed, a deep, enveloping heat that felt as natural as sunshine. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the stove. She ran a gnarled hand over its surface. The stones were not hot to the touch, but deeply, profoundly warm, radiating a gentle energy. She saw the meticulous craftsmanship, the impossibly tight seams, the sheer, deliberate mass of it. "Your father built this," she said, her voice soft with reverence. It was a statement, not a question. Johanna gave a single, small nod. "He remembered the old ways," Martha continued, her gaze distant. "My grandmother used to say a stove like this holds the heart of the fire, not just its angry flame. It remembers the warmth long after the log has turned to ash." Anneliese looked at the old woman, a flicker of something, surprise, recognition, in her deep blue eyes. For the first time, someone had looked at their father's work not as a folly, but with understanding. Martha did not ask where they slept. She did not need to. She saw the stove not as a piece of furniture, but as the core of their survival, and in its silent, stony presence, she felt the echo of a wisdom the new world had carelessly abandoned. As autumn bled its last colors onto the valley floor, winter descended from the high peaks with a sudden, predatory fierceness. The first snows were not a gentle dusting but a heavy, wet blanket that smothered the landscape and did not melt. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, a relentless artist of ice and misery, began to sculpt the world into a new and hostile form. For the settlers in Prospect Creek, the annual battle for survival began. The days grew short and dim, the world shrinking to the small circle of light and warmth cast by their voracious iron stoves. The sound of axes became a constant, desperate rhythm throughout the settlement, a frantic counterpoint to the howling of the wind. Woodpiles that had seemed mountainous in October now looked distressingly small. Men returned from the forests with their sleds only half full, the task of felling frozen trees a brutal, exhausting affair. Inside the cabins, life became a constant struggle against the encroaching cold. Frost crept across the window panes in intricate, beautiful patterns that belied their deadly chill. Draught snaked across the floors, and every venture outside was a painful, lung-searing ordeal. The community's mood soured with the weather. Tempers grew short, and the small cabin of the Hanson sisters became an even greater source of irritation. Their single, thin plume of morning smoke was an affront. While every other chimney in the valley belched a near-constant stream of grey and black, theirs offered only a brief, almost apologetic puff at dawn, and then nothing. It was unnatural. It was impossible. "They're freezing in there," Mrs. Gable insisted, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as if feeling their imagined chill herself. "It's pride. Stubborn, foolish pride. They'd rather turn to ice than admit their father's madness and ask for a proper stove." The townsfolk, huddling closer to their own fires, found it easy to agree. The sisters' perceived suffering became a perverse source of comfort, a confirmation that their own struggles were correct and necessary. They imagined Anneliese and Johanna shivering under thin blankets, their breath turning to frost in the air, paying the price for their strangeness. The reality, which they could not conceive, was one of profound and gentle warmth. Inside the cabin, the great stone stove continued its slow, steady exhalation, a captured sun holding the brutal winter at bay. The sisters moved through their quiet routines in the still, warm air, the distant howl of the wind serving only as a reminder of the sanctuary their father's hands and his memory had built for them. The cold was a monster clawing at the walls, but it could not get in. The blizzard arrived not with a roar but with a suffocating silence. The wind died down, and the sky turned a strange, luminous grey. Then the snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, vertical torrent that erased the world. It fell for a day, and then a night, and then another day. It buried fences, obscured the shapes of cabins, and transformed the familiar landscape into a vast, featureless expanse of white. Prospect Creek was paralyzed, each family an isolated island in a sea of snow. The first sign of crisis came as a faint, desperate sound carried on a brief lull in the storm, the frantic ringing of a handbell from the direction of the Miller farm, the most remote homestead at the western edge of the settlement. The sound was thin and terrified, a plea swallowed almost immediately by the renewed fury of the snow. The men of the settlement gathered in the general store, their faces grim. To attempt to rescue in these conditions was madness. The drifts were higher than a man's head, the visibility was non-existent, and the cold was a physical weapon that could kill in minutes. "Their chimney must be blocked," one man guessed. or they've run out of wood," another added, the fear in his own heart evident in his voice. Every man there knew how quickly a cabin could become a tomb once the fire went out. They were trapped, their conventional wisdom and frontier toughness rendered useless by the sheer overwhelming power of the storm. As the hours passed, a sense of helpless dread settled over the community. They were hardy people, accustomed to hardship, but this was different. This was a force of nature that mocked their tools and their courage. The storm had stripped away their veneer of control, leaving them small and vulnerable. And in this state of heightened anxiety, their thoughts turned, as they so often did, to the Hanson sisters. The concern was now laced with a genuine, if morbid, fear. The Millers, with their sturdy cabin and large woodpile, were in peril. What chance could the two strange sisters have, with their tiny, economical fire? The image of them in their single-room cabin, their foolish stove long gone cold, became a symbol of the ultimate consequence of defying community norms. Their fate seemed sealed, a tragic, inevitable outcome of their stubborn isolation. The need to do something, to act against the suffocating helplessness, began to fester, and it found its focus on the small, silent cabin on the edge of the woods. The decision was made not by logic, but by a rising tide of fear and misguided righteousness. It was Mrs. Gable who gave the impulse a voice. "We cannot just sit here while those poor girls freeze to death," she announced, her voice trembling with a potent cocktail of alarm and authority. "It is our Christian duty to check on them. If they have perished, then God have mercy on their stubborn souls." Her words galvanized the men. Here was a task, a tangible action in the face of overwhelming impotence. Thomas, eager to prove his manhood and to be at the center of the drama, was the first to volunteer. A small group of 4 men, led by Thomas and accompanied by a grimly determined Mrs. Gable, prepared for the expedition. They wrapped themselves in every layer of wool and fur they possessed, tied ropes around their waists to keep from getting separated, and took up lanterns that cast a feeble, dancing light against the wall of white. Their journey was a brutal, elemental struggle. The snow was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating powder that clogged their mouths and noses and pulled at their feet with relentless weight. The wind had returned, driving the snow horizontally, scouring their exposed skin and stealing the breath from their lungs. They moved at a crawl, shouting to each other to stay together, their words snatched away and lost in the gale. To them, this ordeal was a testament to their own virtue, a heroic effort to save the foolish and the weak. Each step deepened their conviction that the Hanson sisters could not possibly have survived this. Their own suffering validated their prejudice. How could 2 women, alone, withstand what was testing the limits for strong men? They were marching to a tragedy, one they had predicted and, in a strange, dark corner of their hearts, almost wished for. It would be a terrible lesson, but a necessary one, about the importance of conforming, of listening to the wisdom of the community. When they finally reached the cabin, it was an alien mound in the landscape, its familiar lines softened and distorted by massive drifts. There were no tracks leading to or from the door. No light shone from the shuttered opening. And most ominously, there was no smoke, not even a wisp, rising from the snow-crowned chimney. The silence was absolute, broken only by the shriek of the wind. They had arrived at the scene of the inevitable, ready to find what they had come for, the cold, still proof of their own correctness. Thomas, his face raw from the wind, hammered his fist against the heavy wooden door. The sound was a dull, flat thud, absorbed by the snow and the silence. "Annalise!" "Johanna," he yelled, his voice hoarse. There was no reply. The men exchanged grim looks. Mrs. Gable clutched her shawl, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "They are gone," she whispered, the words frosting in the air. "The Lord has taken them," but Thomas, fueled by a frantic energy, refused to accept the quiet. He put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It held fast. He tried again, joined by another man, and with a great splintering groan, the latch gave way and the door swung inward, scraping against a drift of snow that had crept over the threshold. They stumbled inside, bracing for a wave of deathly cold. Instead, they were met by a stillness, a profound and gentle warmth that was utterly incongruous with the world outside. It was not the dry, scorching heat of an overworked stove, but a soft, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Their eyes, accustomed to the blinding white of the storm, struggled to adjust to the dim interior. The air was cool enough to be fresh, yet held a core of deep, abiding heat. They looked around the single room, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. The table and chairs were in their usual place. The shelves were neat. And in the great stone stove, a bed of coals glowed with a faint, sleepy red light. It was a tiny fire, a mere handful of embers that could not possibly account for the cabin's comfortable temperature. Panic and confusion began to replace their grim certainty. Where were the sisters? There were no bodies huddled on the floor. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished. Mrs. Gable, her mind reeling, moved deeper into the room, her hand outstretched as if to touch the impossible warmth. She placed her palm against the flat, grey side of the massive stove. It was warm. Not just warm, but alive with heat, a deep, resonant energy pulsing from within the stone. Her fingers traced the seams of the masonry, the perfect lines of her father's work. And then she felt it. A slight indentation. An edge that was not an edge. A small, cunningly wrought iron latch, set so flush with the stone it was nearly invisible. Her breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she lifted the latch. With a soft click, a section of the stonework swung inward, revealing not the fiery heart of a stove, but a dark, quiet cavity. The air that drifted out was soft and warm, carrying the scent of clean linen and sleeping humanity. Thomas raised his lantern, and the small group peered into the opening, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. Inside the thick, insulated wall of the stove was a small, womb-like chamber, just large enough for a narrow bed. And on that bed, nestled together under a simple quilt, lay Anneliese and Johanna, fast asleep. Their faces were calm and peaceful, their breathing slow and even. They were not freezing. They were not suffering. They were cocooned in a sanctuary of warmth, sleeping through the blizzard's fury in perfect safety and comfort, lulled to rest by the gentle heat radiating from the stones all around them. The intruders stood frozen in a tableau of silent, shattering disbelief. The entire narrative they had constructed of the sisters' foolishness, their suffering, their inevitable demise, crumbled to dust in an instant. This was not madness. This was genius. It was an act of such profound and simple wisdom that it defied their entire understanding of the world. They were the fools. Their roaring, inefficient fires were the mark of ignorance, while this silent, breathing stone was the pinnacle of ingenuity. At that moment, the door creaked open again, and Martha stepped inside, her face covered in snow, her breath coming in ragged puffs. She had followed them, a deep sense of foreboding guiding her through the storm. She took in the scene at a glance, the open door to the stove, the sleeping sisters, the stunned faces of the rescue party. She was not surprised. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. "A cachalophon," she said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence that cut through the tension in the room. "A masonry heater. My grandmother told me of them. The fire heats the stone, not the room. The stone remembers the heat." She looked at the stunned faces around her. "You feed it once, in the morning. And it keeps you warm all day, and all night. It is not the size of the fire that matters. It is the wisdom of the stone." Her words hung in the warm, still air, a quiet eulogy for their arrogance and a testament to the forgotten knowledge that lay sleeping peacefully in the heart of the stove. The small sound of the latch clicking back into place was what finally woke the sisters. Anneliese opened her eyes first, her gaze calm and unsurprised as it fell upon the intruders huddled in her home. Johanna stirred beside her. They did not cry out or show any fear. They simply sat up, their movements synchronized as always, and looked out from their sanctuary with an unnerving, quiet dignity. The shame that washed over the townsfolk was a palpable thing, a heat more intense than any fire. They had broken into this home as self-proclaimed saviors, expecting to find tragedy. Instead, they had found wisdom, and in doing so, had revealed the full, ugly depth of their own prejudice. They had violated a place of peace, a sanctuary built not only of stone and clay, but of love, memory, and profound intelligence. Thomas was the first to break the silence. He took off his hat, his hands trembling slightly, his youthful arrogance completely stripped away. He looked at the two women whose faces were level with his own from their raised alcove, and he could not meet their eyes. We thought you were in trouble," he stammered, the words sounding hollow and foolish even to his own ears. "The storm, we were wrong. I am sorry, it was a clumsy, inadequate apology, but it was sincere." Mrs. Gable stood behind him, her face a mess of conflicting emotions. She saw not two strange, stubborn girls, but two resourceful women who had quietly and competently secured their own survival while the rest of the community panicked. She saw the legacy of their father, not as the folly of a madman, but as a gift of enduring love. The stove was his final act of protecting his daughters, an embrace of stone and warmth that would outlast him. She looked at Anneliese and Johanna, and for the first time, she saw them not as outsiders to be pitied or judged, but as pillars of a strength her community desperately needed. The story of what they found in the Hansen cabin spread through Prospect Creek faster than the fire through dry timber, carried by the chase and rescue party. The tale was told not with mockery, but with a new and profound sense of awe. The giant stove was no longer a symbol of strangeness, but a monument to a forgotten way of life, a better way. The sisters' silence was reinterpreted not as arrogance, but as the quiet confidence of those who possessed true knowledge. They had weathered the worst storm in a decade not through luck or magic, but through superior design and a deep understanding of the natural world. Their vindication was complete, and it was as quiet and powerful as the heat emanating from their remarkable home. In the days that followed the Great Blizzard, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the social landscape of Prospect Creek. The Hansen cabin was no longer a place to be avoided or whispered about. It became a destination. People came not to stare, but to learn. They came with offerings, a sack of potatoes, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a bolt of wool, and with questions. They wanted to see the stove, to touch its warm stone, to understand the principle behind its incredible efficiency. Anneliese and Johanna received them with the same quiet grace with which they had endured their scorn. They did not gloat or preach. They simply answered the questions asked of them, their voices soft but clear. They explained how their father had taught them to mix the clay and sand for the mortar, how the internal channels of the stove were designed to snake back and forth, extracting every last bit of heat from the smoke before it escaped up the chimney. They spoke of thermal mass and radiant heat, using simple, direct language that conveyed a knowledge that was both ancient and revolutionary. Thomas became their most devoted student, his earlier mockery replaced by a fervent, humble desire to understand. He spent hours by the stove, sketching its design, learning the rhythm of its firing, his hands tracing the lines of the stonework as if reading a sacred text. Mrs. Gable, for her part, organized the women of the settlement, proposing an idea that would have been unthinkable only weeks before. The community hall, a drafty, barn-like structure that was nearly impossible to heat, should have its own masonry heater. It would be a place of true refuge for the entire settlement, a central heart of warmth that could sustain them through any storm. They asked the Hansen sisters to lead the project. At first, the sisters were hesitant, unaccustomed to the spotlight. But seeing the genuine need and the newfound respect in the eyes of their neighbors, they agreed. The work began in the spring. The entire community participated. The men quarried the river stone, the children helped mix the clay mortar, and the women provided food and support. At the center of it all were Anneliese and Johanna, directing the construction with a quiet, confident authority. They were no longer the stoic outsiders, they were teachers, their father's legacy flowing through them. As the new stove rose in the center of the hall, it became more than a heating device. It was a monument to humility, a symbol of a community that had been strong enough to admit its ignorance and wise enough to embrace a better way. The Hansen sisters, once defined by their isolation, had found their place not by changing who they were, but by waiting patiently for the world to catch up to their wisdom. Their little cabin, with its secret heart of warmth, had saved not only them, but the soul of an entire town.